Welcome to the McMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Beverly Gage, a professor of 20th century U.S. history at Yale University. Her teaching and research focus on the evolution of American political ideologies and institutions. She teaches courses on terrorism, communism and anti-communism, American conservatism, and 20th century American politics. Her first book, The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in Its First Age of Terror, examined the history of terrorism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on the 1920 Wall Street bombing. Today we talk with her about her forthcoming book, G-Man, J Edgar Hoover and the American Century. Welcome, Professor Gage.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, G-Man, which stands for Government Man, is a new big political biography of someone that I would describe as really one of the towering figures, for better or worse, of 20th century American politics. So it's about former FBI Director J Edgar Hoover, who, as many people have pointed out over the years, was one of the longest serving public servants in the United States. So he became director of the FBI in 1924 at the ripe old age of 29.
Wow.
And he remained in that job until 1972, so almost half a century. So it's an attempt to really grapple with Hoover, not only as the villain that he's really become, I think, in the popular imagination, but as a really very serious political figure, someone who had a pretty dramatic influence on American popular political culture and on the shape of American government, and who was someone who was in power for at least half of the 20th century.
Very long time. What led you to write the book?
Well, Hoover actually showed up in my first book, a book called The Day Wall Street Exploded that you just mentioned, which was about a little-known terrorist attack on Wall Street in 1920. It was the biggest terrorist attack of its age, and it killed about 38 people on a kind of ordinary workday at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York. We've largely forgotten it, but at the time it was this huge deal and this huge investigation in the very early years of the FBI. And so Hoover is not director at that point, but he's a very young man, kind of working behind the scenes, beginning to think about the issue, on the one hand, of terrorism, but more importantly, at that moment, of political radicalism, and particularly left-wing radicalism in the United States. And so I encountered him in doing the work on that project really as a very young man, and what was striking to me was that there he is, he's in his mid-20s at that point, and he has not yet become the figure that we are all going to get to know, but he's already thinking through so many of these issues that he's going to become identified with later on, namely, in that case, the kind of war against communism, which so much shapes American politics in the 20th century.
How does your book differ from the many other books out there about Hoover?
Right, well, there are a couple of things that I think make this book different. So Hoover is someone who has been written about obviously a great deal. I think he is still a household name for the most part, although when I talk with my students, they know they've heard of him. They're not always 100% sure which Hoover he is.
Is it
right?
the vacuum or something?
Right. He's fading a little bit, but you know, he's still enough of a name. So anyway, he's been written about obviously for a long time by lots of people, but a lot of the tradition of writing about Hoover has been very much a tradition of expose. So most of the big biographies of Hoover have been books that are seeking to kind of expose his secrets, tell us things that people didn't know at the time that he was actually in political power. So that's part of what my book is as well, but it's also trying to really step back from that a little bit and assess Hoover not only as someone who's keeping secrets, but someone who plays this very big role in American politics, and to kind of take him from the fringes and this idea of him as a rogue villain and really put him back at the center of our political story. So I'd say that's piece one, trying to rewrite that picture of him a little bit. The second thing that the book is doing is trying to put him in conversation with really interesting work that's being done on the kind of history and evolution of American conservatism in the 20th century. And a lot of that work tends to kind of look at a resurgence of grassroots conservatism that begins to happen in the 60s and 70s, and then ultimately comes of age with Ronald Reagan and the Reagan presidency in the 80s. And this is an effort to recast that a little bit and to think about someone like Hoover as an ideological conservative, but an ideological conservative who holds a whole lot of state and government power through the period that we usually think about as the great age of American liberalism. So again, it's sort of recasting him in a different relationship with American politics than I think that we've seen before.
Okay, and in doing your research, and I would imagine one of the big issues is there's so much written about him, but you were able to uncover some things that no other historian has seen before, and also you gained access to some files that had never, or collections, private collections that had never been opened before. How did that come to pass, and what were some of your findings? Right. And just talk about your how you did the research in general.
Well, I'd say the blessing and the curse of doing research on an institution like the FBI is that there's always more to find. So that makes it terrific, because there's always material out there that people haven't really looked at and haven't scrutinized in a serious way.
But in my case, how is that though? How is that no one has come to see it? Are the files just being made open to the public? Is that the situation, or there's just so much that it's impossible for one person to go through it all?
Right. Well, it's kind of a combination of both. So the material that's at the FBI is constantly being processed and sent to the National Archives, but we're talking about millions and millions of pages of material, something that no single person could possibly go through. So to some degree, you can go to the National Archives and begin to look through this material that's been recently released. A lot of the FBI's material, and even pretty far back historical material, even back as early as the teens and the 20s, some of that is still at the FBI, and almost everything from the 50s, 60s, and 70s is still at the FBI and can be acquired through the Freedom of Information Act and through filing Freedom of Information Act requests. So what this means is that, in my case, I happen to be particularly interested in the FBI's relationship with conservative organizations. And so I began to file Freedom of Information Act requests on a whole variety of conservative organizations that, for the most part, people just haven't filed FOIA requests about before, and so therefore the material hasn't come to light. So doing research there is a little bit different, because you can't just go and sit down and have all of it there. You have to actually be rather proactive about finding it. The other question, of course, is redaction. Which is to say, crossing out the names of people, and also declassification, which happens over time. So by the very nature of the passage of time under our current laws, it means that there's always new material coming up, new material being released. I think the last and really interesting thing that's happening is that the generation of people who knew Hoover in the 60s and 70s, or who were officials with him, et cetera, many of those people have become quite elderly or have died over the last 40 years, and so their private collections have also begun to come to light and have been gathered together in a serious way. For instance, L. Patrick Gray, who was Hoover's successor at the FBI very briefly, sort of between the time that Hoover died in 1972 and the time that the kind of Watergate scandal really began to emerge in 73 and 74. He's there in this very critical moment, and his son has actually gathered together a lot of his papers and pulled together a pretty serious collection that hasn't been very widely used.
So what are some of the things that you were able to find that no one has seen before, for instance, or anything in particular that was surprising that you came across?
Right. Well, in terms of some of the documents about Hoover's relationship with with important conservative figures, the conservative movement, I think you can see a real set of kind of serious ideological back and forth that's going on there. I think we tend to have an image of Hoover as being kind of a rogue figure who's getting what he wants by blackmailing people, right? And I mean, certainly this is, to some degree at least, part of what he did. But one of the things that I think that's interesting at looking at these documents that haven't been studied a lot is to see what a careful architect he was about building a pretty widespread political grassroots base for the FBI through these organizations. So everything from women's clubs to the American Legion to more kind of overtly conservative grassroots organizations. You can actually see his skills, I think, as a politician in that sense, in ways that aren't as often recognized. And then there are all sorts of, just sort of interesting little anecdotes that come up in the papers as well, ways that he deals with the press. I mean, particularly Hoover as a young man, you can see him sort of struggling in 1935 to invite certain reporters into the FBI, and then they betray him and he denounces them, and you can just, so I think you actually get a very lively sense of who he is as a person, again, beyond this sort of rather one-dimensional view that we've
How would you
inherited.
characterize him as a person from your research that you've done so far?
Right. Well, I think he is a rigid person. He is a person who likes to be in control. And I think that those things are not probably terribly surprising to people. But, one of the things that is interesting is really thinking about him, in fact, as a person, as someone who, as a young man, liked to go out to nightclubs and stay out late, as someone who is cracking jokes with his friends within the FBI, someone who's actually having a real struggle about what it means to be in this position of power, is clinging very tightly to it in certain ways. So I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say that I like J Edgar Hoover a whole lot, in the sense that I would, want to sit down and enmesh my life with his, although I suppose my life is kind of enmeshed with his in a certain way. But I do feel more sort of empathetic to him, and I have seen him come alive as a person in a way, again, that these pictures of him as a pure kind of almost inhuman villain, I think, don't quite capture.
One of the things you do talk about in the book, I guess one would call it the more salacious kind of rumor or gossip, is his relationship with Clyde Tolson and the conjecture as to whether he is homosexual or not. What have you found along those lines? Anything?
Right. Well, I think we're probably never going to have an absolute smoking gun in the sense that we know, the most intimate details of what Hoover did in his own bedroom. But in fact, we don't know that about most people. So in some ways, that's not particularly unique. What's really interesting to me, particularly about Hoover and Tolson, is it's very clear that they were each other's chief emotional supports, that they maintained a 40-year relationship with each other, a kind of deeply loyal and intimate relationship, which I think it's not a stretch to imagine being sexual, though we have no particularly distinct evidence about that. But what's been really striking to me, and I think the ways in which the book will be sort of useful and talk about this in different ways, is just how public that relationship was. And I think people have an idea that to have a partnership like that, a partnership where many people openly kind of speculated that these men were having a homosexual relationship, that to have had that in the mid-century United States, you would have needed to be somehow deeply, deeply hidden. And on the one hand, you can see this as a hidden and closeted relationship, but on the other hand, they were a very public couple. I mean, you invited Edgar to dinner, and you were also going to invite Clyde. And so they were accepted and functioned really as a social couple over the long term. And I think it kind of upends some of our contemporary binaries about, there's straight and there's gay, and there's no sort of other way to function socially. I think they were sort of a unique or interesting case study in that sense.
But during that time period when they were so together and went out socially and everyone invited them together as a couple, almost like it was a marriage, it strikes me as somewhat hypocritical for him to then have behaved toward the gay world in the manner that he did. Will you be talking about that at all in your book?
Absolutely, and this is one of the great, I mean, Hoover is, if he is anything, right, he is someone who is full of contradictions, right? And we can call them contradictions, we can call them hypocrisy, which often is not inaccurate either. But yeah, I mean, Hoover is certainly one of the architects of what is now described as the Lavender Scare, right, which sort of parallels the Red Scare, particularly in the 40s and 50s, in which homosexuality is understood to be a national security threat. And so it's a very perplexing situation. Here is a man that many people understand to at least be suggestively homosexual, right, who is militantly also cracking down on homosexuals. And so I think we have to understand this both as a kind of defense of his own position, and I think more interestingly, see the ways in which he crafts the FBI as a kind of defense against these accusations, in part, right? A very, very masculine, kind of male-centered institution, right? And with a sort of very interesting and distinct public image, this image of the G-man that emerges in this moment. I think one of the things that's going to be really fun to play with in the final version of the book are these representations of a certain kind of masculinity, how people understood that then, and how we want to understand it now.
How do you think that Hoover, in that span of 50 years, shaped the American political culture?
Well, I think Hoover did a couple of things. So one thing is that he, though we tend to, as I said, again, think of him as this kind of rogue figure, in many ways he is adopting what are the essential kind of liberal techniques of state building, government efficiency, kind of insulating administrative managers and bureaucrats from the evil influences of politics. All of these things which often progressives embraced, which certainly the New Deal embraced in many ways, the strengthening of the federal government. All of these things that we tend to think of as being somehow inherently liberal or progressive or often framed in that way in the way we talk about American politics. He sort of takes these tools of state building and uses them to build a very different part of the American state and of the American government. So I think he's very interesting as a kind of bureaucratic architect and as a kind of case study in that. In terms of his political influence, I do think that he was one of the most important people, certainly within the government itself, in sort of containing and limiting the left in the 20th century. And I think in some ways this is one of the biggest messages of the book is, as I said, I talk about him as a conservative who held a whole lot of government power in an age when we tend to think of as the age of liberalism, right? This kind of mid-century moment. And one of the things that he spent a lot of his life doing is watching and policing kind of radical movements on the left. And I think in the end, kind of containing and shaping American culture, both through kind of policing the left and through very overtly promoting a kind of conservative anti-communist message that had great influence and resonance in the United States.
Okay, and your book will be out in
2014 to 15. So I have a few more years of working on it.
Well, we will certainly watch for that because I think it will be a very interesting read. Thank you so much for being here today with us and sharing some of your work.
Great, thanks, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Gage and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.